It's wonderful to be with all of you, and I am really excited to explore digital games with you today and really look at potential that we see for addressing pragmatics in a language classroom in a really meaningful way. So the first thing that I want to emphasize is that I look at digital games, and we look at digital games as a tool for exploration, right? We live in a really complex world. And I used to chuckle when I was in my former life teaching Spanish for an international baccalaureate program because I got about 30 words to tell my administrator, who was coming in to observe me, about my classroom culture. What's going on in your classroom that I need to know about? And the fact was, I didn't even know everything that was going on in my classroom that he needed to know about, because each of my students brought their own context to the classroom. And without doing exhaustive interview processes with them every single day, it's impossible for me to know what happened yesterday to Rachel, or why Quinn is upset, or what's impacting how Max is viewing this image that we're looking at today, right? So we have this beautiful, messy, contextual space that we're working in, and honestly, as practitioners, it can be a little daunting, right? How do we negotiate this messy space? What I really see is that empathy and cultivating an environment in which empathetic discourse is possible is a tool for addressing that complication that we have. And digital games facilitate, to an extent, that environment and its existence in a classroom. So that leads us to our next slide. We are not in the business of having our students appropriate. And here we see an image that I know a lot of people would qualify as offensive, right? You have people dressing as members of different cultures, probably for Halloween, right? In a way that celebrates stereotypical representations, in a way that could be construed as poking fun to certain aspects of these cultures, things along those lines, right? But we all have some sort of cultural values that we bring to the table, right? We talk about the diverse contexts in the classroom. The context, the institutional context in which I'm operating, is another context that impacts the classroom. And what I think our charge is as educators and practitioners is, even though we have these personal contexts, is to really cultivate a neutral space, right? Where we allow learners to realize the ideas and values that they have, that they may not even know existed, right? Where we encourage them to talk about those even when we disagree with them, right? We have to give learners that space, or else we establish a power dynamic in which some of you are right and some of you are wrong, and those of you who are wrong have already lost, because we've said what you see and what you think is not worth exploring, right? So we're in this place where we look at digital games as really this tool for building awareness. I love this quote because learning and experience are inextricable partners, right? We know this. We learn by doing. What I love about the games that we'll talk about today and our approach to using games is that they give us a simulated environment in which we can have an experience that we may not have otherwise had. And that experience can open the eyes of students to other ideas and realities that they may have never even considered. And that way, they're acting with intentionality and not with ignorance, right? Sometimes there's going to be miscommunication because we are ignorant, right? A great example from my personal life, I have a friend from Persia who invited me to lunch right after I met her for the first time. I said no. She invited me to lunch again. I said no. She invited me to lunch again. I said no. And then I was getting angry. Like, woman, I said no. I'm done. I really have to go. But what was she doing? She was trying to emphasize how sincere her invitation was, right? Was I wrong to be annoyed by it? I don't think so. For me, it was something that was culturally foreign, right? I never had somebody invite me to lunch so many times after I said no, right? But for her, she was really trying to extend this very sincere invitation. So she was right too. And we have this situation where we were both right, but we were different, right? We were both right, but we were different. So certainly, I'm not advocating that the way that we build international mindedness and perspective build perspectives within our students is that we hand them a bunch of video games. Like, play, you'll leave. You will be competent communicators after you play these games. Good job, go, right? That would be lovely. We could write a really short book, make a lot of money, and be done with this whole endeavor. But that's not what we want to do. So what we utilize in this project that we'll look at are thinking routines. Thinking routines, if you are not familiar with them, are pretty common in a lot of K-12 contexts, but essentially what you do is you have think, pair, share. Raise your hand if you've heard of think, pair, share. Right? It's a good one. This one's my favorite, actually. See, think, wonder. No, not as much. That's okay. We also have more. Think, puzzle, explore. Step inside. Stoplight. Options explosion, which I picked for the title alone. This is one I've never used myself. But we see a lot of research in this area, particularly if you're interested at it. There's a visual thinking team, part of Project Zero at Harvard Graduate School of Education. There's another group called Deep Design Thinking, and they really look at thinking routines. And what they've found at Harvard through their research is that really thinking routines, in order to be actualized and realized appropriately, have certain needs. They have structural needs and epistemological needs. The structural needs are pretty obvious, right? They're almost axiomatic. The teacher has to believe that the thinking routine works. That's one of the big ones, right? The teacher also has to repeat the thinking routine over time. We don't just do it today and never do it again for it to be effective. We do it over and over again. And lastly, the teacher also has to be explicit in their instruction regarding the thinking routine. When we think about the epistemological characteristics, we want to think about what they've identified as moves and messages. So the moves are basically the thinking activities that the students engage in. If you've noticed, they really progress from a information gathering level, right? So we're labeling at this level, we're listing, we're noticing, we're observing, to an analysis level, or a what did I want to say? I've lost the word, it's escaped my head, but to an analysis level. So at that point, they start to compare and contrast, right? They start to question. They start to really think about this knowledge that they've gathered. They process it. And then the third step in these thinking routines is typically the application phase, right? It's where they start to try this knowledge that they've acquired and processed in their own lives. It's where they start to build their own knowledge. And it's really beautiful in the way that it really starts to get learners to realize what it is that they think that they may not have realized before, what value judgments that they place on knowledge. I will give you an example from See, Think, Wonder, from a workshop I attended called Perspective Building and International Mindedness, or something along those lines. And the woman gave us this beautiful brick building. It was a picture. She didn't give us the building. I realized that that was ambiguous in my language there. She gave us a photo of a brick building. It was 3 stories tall, red bricks. Outside, there was a clothesline with clothes hanging on it, and there were some cars in a parking lot. So she asked us all to write for 1 minute about what we saw in that image. Then 1 minute about what we thought about the image, and lastly, what we wondered about the image. Then as a classroom of educators in professional development, we came out and we started talking about it. What people immediately said that they saw were types of buildings, right? Even though the thing that we saw was a 3-story building made from red brick, what they said they saw were housing projects, which is a logical assumption if you are from the southeastern United States, because that building looked exactly like most of the housing projects that are common in that area. But we had a few Northeasterners in our group as well, and they started talking about how they saw their apartment building, middle-class housing that they grew up in, right? And so we started to pick apart. We all looked at the same artifact. We all saw the same thing, but what we actually saw were different. We had different judgments about the same artifact. So we adopt this variation of a thinking routine suggested by Ishihara and Cohen in their wonderful book about teaching pragmatics, where first learners observe language in action, then they analyze it, then they extend. That extension could be practice, application in different contexts, things along those lines. So we'll break down a couple of games that we chose and the activities that went along with them so you kind of get an idea of what this might look like in practice in a classroom. Before we look at these games, I will say that they are intentionally provocative games because we want students to explore language. We also want them to explore topics that are meaningful and that are important to the world. So this first game is called Plague Inc. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it is a very intense game. I see some nods. It's satirical in the sense that your goal is actually to wipe out humanity, right? It was created for STEM students. And basically what you do is you start a virus of some sort, and then you try to evolve your virus as it spreads throughout the world. So it becomes a super bug, and it kills everybody. I know that sounds pretty dystopian and pretty pessimistic, but I actually think this game is full of hope. Right, we're looking at the same artifact and having different conclusions about it, but because you see how interconnected the world is as you play the game, right? This thing that happened in rural China is now impacting Greenland in a way that is really meaningful. You start to actually see there's a newsreel, and throughout the game, you start to see that countries are trying to collaborate and rush research and funding so that they can act against this terrible plague. So we actually see this kind of hopeful narrative. Perhaps it's just because I want to see it, but I see it there. And so we actually use that in our classroom to talk about what does this interconnectedness mean, right? And some students don't like it. They don't like it at all because in this case, our interconnectedness helped a plague spread. Right? But others like it because they do see the potential for the interconnectedness to increase collaboration and motion. And my goal as the practitioner is to let them both have those opinions and let them think through it and talk about it. So we use this game a lot to look at genre and text conventions. So essentially what the students do is first they start their observation on Twitter. We want them to acquire some vocabulary that they need to talk about health. And so they look at different target language tweets that are related to World Health. Then we have them discover tweeting conventions, right? So we find some conference with live tweeting. We find that hashtag and we research that hashtag and have the students come up with a list of conventions for tweeting, right? What kind of language do you see here? How formal is it? How informal is it? Do you see a lot of emojis? Do you see in a professional context? What do you see? And they make their own conventions. And then they play Plague Inc. We go back to a little observation. They just get familiar with the game. And then after that, they're assigned different countries, and they have to originate the plague and start live tweeting the spread of the plague. And using the class hashtag that we've already developed so that they can follow what's going on in the other countries. They can tag each other and ask for help. We need more research, can you help us? And they can really practice what it is to tweet in the target language, right? So we're using these difficult topics. We're talking about really, look, requests for assistance, mortality rates. These are not things that you find in chapter 1 of your textbook usually, right? It is not, hola, ¿cómo estás? Right? We're moving beyond it, but this is something an intermediate, lower, intermediate, mid student can handle, right? So we're letting them kind of explore it that way. So the next one is this war of mine, which, let me see if I will show, I think we have time for me to show you a quick trailer from this war of mine.
For soldiers, war is about victory. For us, it was about getting food. I lived through hell with these people. We were a group. We would do anything to stay alive. I will never forget those days. Things you see in war stay with you forever.
A kiedy przyjdzie także po mnie zegarmistrz światła purpurowy, by mi zabełtać błękit w głowie, to będę jasny i gotowy. Spłyną przede mnie dni na przestrzał, zgasną podłogi i powietrza. Na wszystko jeszcze raz popatrzę.
So in this one, we actually have the learners play the game very first. They play the game, they start to take notes about language functions that we actually find to be pretty benign in day-to-day contexts of normalcy, right? Going next door to ask my neighbor to borrow some food, I need a cup of sugar or an egg, it's a pretty easy thing to do when I know my neighbor has access to food. It's a completely different conversation when none of us can get our food, right? So the students, first they play this war of mine, and then they see all of these language functions happening. They bump into people on the street as they play, and then they start to imagine, how are these functions different in situations of fear, like we see in the game, versus situations of normalcy? Then we send them to find target language texts where they analyze one language function in both of those situations, take notes on it, and then we break down what they've noticed in a classroom conversation, right? So we look at actual linguistic forms, we look at the impact of using certain types of language in the context of fear. We ask them all these series of discussion questions, and then we let them practice it. We assign them a character from the game, and then they role play what that character would do. If you've never played the game, you get information about the character. You kind of get to know them as you play. And we give them a goal, some sort of language function that they have to engage in is implied. And they start to interact in the ways that they see are typical. So then, at the end, we break down those interactions and talk about if we agree with the decisions people made in the conversations or not, and things along those lines, so that they really start to get an idea of how language is impacted by the world, or the lens with which we see the world, right? That is the whole goal of this. So some key ideas to leave you with is that we really want learners to be granted the opportunity to cultivate the knowledge that they need and the skills that they need to increase their intercultural communicative competence. Thinking routines grant that opportunity, right? They start to give the students thinking the way that we need them to think so that they can develop those knowledge and skills. We want learners to be supported in the analysis of what they see. We sometimes have to check ourselves and not say, no, that's wrong, right? We have to let them explore and justify what they see and lead them through the analysis and really breaking it apart and understanding the implications of the kind of lens they bring to the table. And we want them, by extension, to remain autonomous. And so I leave you with this quote, another way to really summarize what Kid President said right here, is that something I've already said, but essentially people, even when they disagree, I'm borrowing this from the International Baccalaureate, but people, even when they disagree, can also be right, right? So we want the students to really have the opportunity to explore and realize what they're seeing. Thank you. We'll turn it over to Christopher.